Now I'd like to introduce the next speaker of the session, Professor Piyush Tiwari, Professor of Property, University of Melbourne, Australia. Dr. Piyush Tiwari is a Professor of Property at University of Melbourne, Australia. Prior to his current position, he was Director Policy at Infrastructure Development Finance Company, India, where he was responsible for formulating policies for private financing of urban infrastructure in close cooperation with national and state governments. He was also the editor of India Infrastructure Report 2011 on water. Earlier, he was Senior Lecturer, Property and Program Leader, MSc International Real Estate Markets at Business School, University of Aberdeen, UK. He has held positions at large mortgage company HDFC, India and the University of Tsukuba, Japan. His research interests include infrastructure policy, housing economics, mortgages, commercial real estate investment, and financing infrastructure in developing countries. He has published numerous research papers on issues related to real estate and infrastructure. He has published a book titled International Real Estate Economics. He is a member of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. His other professional activities include Director, Asian Real Estate Society, and Associate Editor, the International Real Estate Review. Let us now proceed to Dr. Piyush's presentation.
Hello, and warm welcome to everyone who has joined us today. My name is Piyush Tiwari, and I'm Professor in Property at the University of Melbourne. First of all, I would like to thank SRM Institute of Technology and the organizers of the conference, in particular Anita, who gave me this opportunity to speak to you. Today, I'll talk about the housing question in India. This question has preoccupied the minds of policymakers for the last 70 years. And the answer is as elusive as it was then. Let me share some slides. What we will do today is to ask 4 questions. The first question is, why housing is still an unresolved question? The second question that we'll ask is what housing policy aims to do and what it has achieved. What research tells us, in particular related to household decision making, related to their meeting of housing needs, and about building technology. And finally, how should policy respond to research? This messy chart here indicates how Indian economy has grown over the last 5 years. Since 1990, we have witnessed phenomenal economic growth in India. However, that growth hasn't been equitably distributed. The thick, bold black line here is the average annual growth of net domestic product in India. It indicates that it has been above 10% on an annual yearly basis. However, when we look at the states, which are the all other lines, some states have grown faster and some states have lagged behind. Why this is important is because it indicates how incomes or how household incomes have grown in different states, and there is considerable variation. Now, this particular chart, which we constructed in order to understand what is the minimum housing size that is required for an average household in different states. It's also segregated or disaggregated by urban and rural areas. So the blue bars here is the average household size in square meter that is required in each state. Orange is for the urban areas and this red bar here is for the rural areas. Now there is considerable variation. And these variations arise because the household sizes are different in different states. Some of these could be cultural, some of these could be affordability related. But the average household size varies across different states, which then means that if we apply the norms which are related to meeting the requirement of individual to live in a space which is not congested, certain size of house would be required. Now, what is important here is the states which are rich, like for example, take Tamil Nadu here, as you're all based in Chennai, probably attending this conference. So in Tamil Nadu, based on the average household size, the minimum housing size required is about 60 square meter. But when we look at, let's say, Punjab, it's almost about 75 square meter. In Uttar Pradesh, the household sizes are big. The average housing size should be around 90 square meter. Another observation that one can make from this particular chart is that the richer states, like for example Gujarat, Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, where the per capita income is higher, the household sizes are lower, the housing requirements are much more modest compared to when we look at UP or Bihar, where the household sizes are bigger, incomes are lower, but in order to meet the congestion-free norms, a bigger house will be required. So there is considerable variation. When we look at how much a household can afford, now this particular chart here shows for the middle income household, what is the desired value of an affordable house for a middle income based on their affordability levels. The affordability here has been defined as they shouldn't be spending more than 30% of their income on housing. It indicates that in Delhi, a middle income household, given that their incomes are larger, can afford a house which is valued at 8 million rupees. But while in Bihar, they cannot afford a house more than 1 million rupees. In Tamil Nadu, they cannot afford a house which is more than about 3 million rupees or 30 lakh rupees. So again, there is a considerable variation in affordability, even when we are talking about middle income households. But when we look at what is being constructed or what is being supplied, here is an interesting figure that Knight Frank has collected. In 2019, almost half of the houses that were constructed had a price tag of 5 million or less. But what is worthy to note here is that almost half had a price tag which was more than 5 million. It indicates that for majority of India here, if you look at 50 or 5 million, there are only very few states where middle income household can afford the house. In the rest of the India, a large part of the population, even though they are middle income, I'm not talking about economically weaker section or below poverty line households, they cannot afford a decent house or an apartment. We computed the affordability levels in 2020 for different income groups, dividing the income groups into 6 income classes: below poverty line, economically weaker section, low income group, middle income group, higher middle income group, and higher income group. What we find here is a very stark reality. For the rental housing, the housing stress is severe for lower income, economically weaker section and below poverty line household, because they would be spending more than 30% of their income on a rental house. When we look at the ownership house, the stress is far greater for middle income, lower income, economically weaker and below poverty line household. because the ratio of house price to annual income of these households are 4 or greater. It's quite substantial. The only households who can afford a house without stressing themselves are the higher middle income or the higher income groups. One of my colleagues, they calculated the urban housing shortage. Now, I think the term housing shortage is not the right term here, because we are not talking about homeless households. We are talking about households who have a housing, but it may be inadequate. So the way the housing shortage has been defined here, it includes inadequate housing. And what is interesting here is that in urban India, they calculate that there is an inadequacy of 50 million housing. A large part is concentrated for economically weaker section. Together, there is an inadequacy of 48 million housing for economically weaker sections, which is about 97% of the total housing shortage or housing inadequacy. So the problem one that we encounter with regard to housing is that housing shortage is not cumulative, but disaggregated. Disaggregated by income, disaggregated by regions. Using a macro figure is not adequate, but we need to understand the nuances at much more disaggregated level. Now let's look at another story. Now this particular picture here indicates the proportion of households who undertook construction activity during 2018. This is based on one of the national surveys that was conducted by National Sample Survey Organization. What it indicates is that on an average, 6% of households have undertaken construction activity during 2018, which is a very small proportion. Again, there is a variation. Some states, the construction activity is much larger than the other. Take, for example, Tamil Nadu here. Less than 4% of households undertook construction activity. In states like Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, the construction activity is much larger. We would need to understand the nature of construction activity a little bit more. But here it would suffice to make a point that these construction activity in poorer states like, for example, Bihar or UP are more to adjust housing through extension or improvement. Richer states like, for example, in Tamil Nadu, or if we take Karnataka, or maybe take another one, Gujarat, the construction activity is low. The reason could be that households are already living in adequate housing. Their housing is much more of a permanent nature or pakka nature, which doesn't require extension, alteration, or repair. Now, this graph here indicates the proportion of households who undertook construction activity and accessed government or banking finance or the formal finance. Now, what is important here is that the role of formal finance in financing construction for household is very minimal. The penetration rate of mortgage is just about 8% in India, which is very low compared to many of the developed countries or even developing countries. So again, if you look at the states, the dark blue line here is the bank finance and the lighter blue here is the government finance. You can see here that the bank finance, the blue line, dark blue line, for many of the states is a very tiny component. So on an average, if you look at the Indian situation, less than 10% of household who undertook construction accessed bank finance. About 20% who undertook construction was supported by government subsidies or government finance. So the role of finance has been very limited. So the second problem that we encounter is that the housing finance is not equitably distributed. Different states have different ability to access housing finance. States which are richer, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, Gujarat, the percolation of formal bank finance is larger than other states. Now let's look at the policy. Since independence, a number of policies have been formulated in order to address the housing problem. The most comprehensive and most detailed has been the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, which was launched a few years back. It has 4 pillars, and there are some submissions. The first pillar is the in situ rehabilitation of existing slum dwellers using land as a resource through private participation. What this is expecting that with the private sector capital and private intervention and capacity, in situ rehabilitation of existing slums could be undertaken. The second pillar is the credit linked subsidy scheme, again being implemented through lending institutions monitored by the nodal agencies such as National Housing Bank and HUDCO. So this is an interest subvention scheme, whereas for eligible household, subsidy on interest is provided. The third is the affordable housing in partnership. This is for the development of new affordable housing in partnership with the private sector. The fourth is the subsidy for beneficiary-led individual house construction or enhancement. This could be for the new housing construction or for an extension or enhancement of an existing house. Subsidy is provided by the government, but is initiated by the local agencies in state, such as municipal government or some other state agencies, in order to access the subsidy from the government at the central level. Then there are submissions. So one of the major submissions is technology submission, which looks at developing sustainable and cost-effective technological solution. The second submission is about global housing technology challenge. Look at the technologies that exist elsewhere in the world, adapt and contextualize to India so as to reduce the cost and develop sustainable housing. COVID-19 posed another problem, which was related to the migrants. Sudden exodus of migrants from major city brought another dimension of inadequacy at the forefront. This was the lack of rental housing. So keeping that in mind, another submission addresses affordable rental housing complexes. What has been the progress so far? Now, if we look at the total approved housing under the PMAY, by December 2019, it has been around 10.3 million. What is important to note here is the disaggregation. Much has happened in the space of beneficiary-led housing construction or extension activity. 6 million houses have been approved in that category. What it says is that the market has not functioned adequately to respond to the pillars that PMAY has. The in situ rehabilitation of slum has contributed very marginal. The credit linked subsidy scheme again has approved only 0.8 million. Affordable housing in partnership, just about 3 million. So these are largely the pillars which require market intervention, which haven't functioned. Now, if we look at another dimension, where are these sanctioned PMAY houses have been? If we normalize them as per state domestic product, which means for 1 billion rupees of state domestic product, how many houses have been approved? What is interesting is that leave some outliers there, like for example, Mizoram or Andhra Pradesh or Tripura, which are quite small states. Much of the concentration of the houses that have been approved under PMAY have been in richer states, like for example, Gujarat or Maharashtra, or let's say Tamil Nadu and so on. The poorer states like Rajasthan or maybe Odisha, they have had fairly small share of the houses that have been approved. Now again, where the need is, the subsidy is not reaching there. What could be the reason? Now, the reason is the capacity at the state or the municipal level. The scheme, such as beneficiary linked construction, requires that the local government develops those schemes, does initial due diligence, and approaches the central for excess of that subsidy. If we look at the municipal capacity, the municipal's capacity largely lies in the richer state, like for example, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, or Andhra to some extent, Karnataka, where the municipal revenue per capita is quite high. This has the governance angle, this has the capacity building angle, this has the local demand angle. But what it says here is that the richer states and richer municipalities are able to capitalize on the PMAY much better than the poorer states and poorer municipalities. So this is the problem 3, which states that the markets have not responded to PMAY. The benefits have largely been reaped by well-off states. The final problem statement that I want to make here is related to the carbon footprint of ongoing and proposed construction activity related to residential sector. Now, if we assume that on an average 6 million houses would be constructed or extended per year over the next 10 years, because if the gap is 50 million, and if we have to meet that gap in the 9 or 10 years, roughly about 6 million houses would have to be constructed. The footprint of this in terms of carbon dioxide emission would be about 114 million ton of emissions that this construction activity would generate. This is largely coming from the material that is used and their carbon footprints. So now this particular figure indicates here how much of different material would be necessary to meet the requirement of 6 million per year and what it means in terms of the carbon footprint. So this raises the problem 4, that if business as usual in construction continues, the projected carbon footprint is very large. What does research tell us? Now, let me very briefly talk about a housing ladder. This we developed as part of our research. What this ladder tells us how households make their decision with regard to their housing. On the horizontal axis, we have the stages of life that one goes through during their life cycle. And on the vertical axis, we have possible housing alternatives. Now let's start with stage 1, where one leaves a house and possibly begins their first job and starts to live in a new home of their parents. At this stage, one would possibly live in a shared tenancy or may rent a house which is very small. As this household goes through their life cycle, their requirement for housing changes. Now, again, the requirements would be contextualized in the context of low income, middle income, and higher income household. The low income household would possibly start from a shared tenancy. Middle income household would be able to rent a house, and higher income probably would be able to rent a private home. As they move through their life cycle, when they have a family, when their family grows bigger, children grow big, their requirement for housing also changes. The requirement for housing changes from shared tenancy towards a larger private rental housing and so on. A lower income household may at a later stage become a homeowner or may not become a homeowner. Middle income household, when they are somewhere around 45 to 50 years, they may be able to become a homeowner. The upper income household would much quicker in terms of becoming a homeowner. So we need to understand where a household in terms of their life cycle is and what their requirements are. And this has profound impact on the housing market. Why this is important? Because many of the tenures which are mentioned here, they either don't exist or they are in a fragmented state in India. The other important question or other important aspect that our research found was the challenge that was related to mortgages. Now, if we look at how the mortgage repayments are and how the incomes move over a life cycle, they are completely opposite to what one would require. When, let's say, at 35 years of age, a person is able to buy their first home. At this point, given that most of the mortgages have repayment which remain almost similar over the life cycle, but the real cost of mortgage is quite high. If we convert that mortgage repayment into the present value, given that in nominal terms, the mortgage repayment remains equal throughout the life cycle, the real cost of mortgage will keep on decreasing as one ages. But this is exactly opposite to how incomes operate. The income increases as a household age. So what happens is, at the beginning, when their incomes are low, the burden of repayment is far bigger. But when at a later date, when the incomes are high, the burden of mortgages reduce. The third piece of research is on how households make their decision to adjust their housing consumption. Now we saw that affordability is a big problem. So what households do is that they incrementally adjust their housing requirement. But the formal finance favors new construction. The finance for incremental or upgradation of housing is very limited. So households bridge the gap between the construction cost and formal finance through the use of their saving. But if the gap is large, they choose to repair or alter existing structure rather than completely renovating, completely rebuilding. Now, why this is important? Now, suppose a household is living in a kacha house or a semi-pakka house, where maybe roof is a thatch roof, some walls are mud, flooring is mud. So household, instead of replacing this house with a more durable housing, they would incrementally upgrade the structure. The reason is because they have to fund this through the use of their saving. Now, if the gap between the construction cost and formal finance is very large, then households will use their own labor to reduce construction cost. Households in urban areas are more likely to rebuild rather than repair. This could be because the land is not that easily available. So one has to go vertical. What we also found that 1% decrease in savings reduces the choice to rebuild by 0.41%. What is also interesting is that 1% increase in formal finance increases the rebuild merely by 0.03%. The role of formal finance is very limited. In terms of technology, you saw that using the conventional technologies, the footprint of carbon footprint to build 6 million houses is about 114 million tons. And these are the requirement of different building materials. Now we experimented, we simulated using other alternative technologies, which are there in the market. And agencies like Development Alternatives or CostFord have been developing and promoting these for many years. If we use those, the carbon dioxide emission to construct 6 million houses would be just about 44 million. This is almost 1/3 or less than 1/3 of what the conventional methods of construction imposes on environment. It's not in this slide, but what we also found that the low-cost technologies are cheaper compared to the conventional technology by between 30 to 50%. The next question then arises is how should policy respond to this research or these different observations that we have made so far? The first is that we need a full spectrum of housing tenure. Rental housing has been missing as a tenure in Indian context. Rental housing is largely supplied by individual, mom and dad type of investors. The institutionalized rental housing doesn't exist. The public housing exists only through the employer provided housing or to a very limited extent under various programs that different states have built. But a formal institutionalized rental housing doesn't exist. In the rest of the world, a new concept, build to rent, is emerging. Now, build to rent incentivizes institutions with large pool of funds such as insurance or the pension funds. They invest in housing which is meant for rental. And these rental housing could then, depending on the segment that they are targeting, could be available for different consumers. These can also be for affordable housing, wherein the gap between the market rent and the affordable rent could be subsidized through various programs. The second is in terms of financing. Now we have observed that the financing doesn't work, the conventional financing doesn't work. The reason is because at the beginning, the down payment requirements for a household are too large. So there are some innovative financing mechanisms. I'm not saying these are the only ones, but these are some of those. In the UK and Australia and many other countries, shared equity is one of the ways in which a housing association or a public entity, they take a joint equity in the house. This reduces the down payment requirements of buyer, puts them on the housing ladder, and over a period of time, they can increase their equity. The households can increase their equity by buying the equity from the public entity or the housing association. To give you an example, now suppose a value of a new house is 200,000. Now let's say the household can access a formal finance of about 150,000, but they would need 50,000 as their down payment, which a household of 35 years age may not be able to afford because this is too large a down payment requirement. So here a government loan or a housing association loan to the extent of say 40,000 could be provided, and the remaining 10,000 could be the household's share in the down payment. Now what would happen then is that household would pay the mortgage repayments for the loan that they have taken from a conventional lender. It could be a bank or a lending institution, and would pay a rent commensurating the contribution of the public entity or the housing association. Over a period of time, households can buy this equity from the government as their income increases. Now suppose that a house after some time in the future is sold, the gain from the capital is distributed between the housing association and the household in proportion of their equity. So what it does, it allows households to benefit from the capital appreciation of house. It also allows them to benefit from the home ownership. There could also be innovative planning mechanisms which could incentivize beneficiary-led construction. There are a number of planning instruments. Land pooling is one of them, has been tried in India, where different households that pool their land. The land parcel is readjusted and redistributed with better amenities to the original households. This increases the capital value of the land and also provides the necessary infrastructure which may be lacking in that particular area. Land pooling could also help in bringing households together in order to reconstruct their dilapidated or degenerated housing. The other type of planning instrument is graduated density zoning, where the planning could change the density or FAR norms, but would require households to come together in order to benefit from that increased density norms. This again could lead one to commercialize the value, land value, and use it for upgrading housing. The third is the land trust, which is an interesting instrument that has been used in Japan. What it does, it creates an entity called entrustee, wherein households, they sell their land to this entrustee who pools the land together, builds a new housing or new real estate, much better. Households have a right to an apartment to live in, and also they can benefit from the profits that the entrustee generates from pooling the land. Now this kind of model is again an interesting one, but requires the trust law to incorporate real estate as part of them. Some of these we have discussed in our paper. In terms of technology, now we know that the low-cost technologies have their advantages, both from the cost as well as emissions point of view. But they haven't been adopted, though they've been around for many years, but they haven't been mainstreamed. They haven't got mainstreamed. Now, the submissions that the PMAY has emphasizes on sustainable technologies. But do we need to look for them? Do we need to develop them? Or do we need mechanism which would allow some of the technologies which already exist to get adopted? Now here a carrot and stick approach would be necessary, and our research indicates that suppose if we impose a carbon tax or energy tax at sufficient level, it can motivate developers and households to switch from the business as usual towards the low cost technologies. So what we did, we said that, like, let's say the conventional technologies are here, and this is the level of energy consumption, and they cost this much. Okay, so if we impose a tax, which would of course increase the cost of these, so this increased tax would, given the level of cost that a household could afford or a developer's price tag is at, they would have to switch, because this increased cost would impose a problem. So they would switch to those technologies which are low cost technologies, or low construction technologies, low construction cost technologies. And this also is associated with less emission. If the tax is further increased, there could be a shift towards low cost technologies such as use of mangalore tiles or fly ash and so on. So it's important that some of these instruments are implemented in order to motivate shift, which haven't happened over the last many years since the technologies have been evolved and developed. There could also be some carrot approach, like for example concessional project finance schemes for builders, wherein there could be subsidy available for adopting low-cost technologies. The building bylaws would also need some sort of rationalization or updation to mandate green concepts. So what I want to summarize this by saying is that the housing question in India is not a technical question. It's a structural question. It's an institutional question. It's a policy question, which requires innovative policy approaches and better understanding of nature of problem. If we understand the problem better, we would be able to devise solutions which are contextualized and which are far more effective than what they are at the moment. With this, I will stop here, and thank you very much for listening, and wish you all the best, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Piyush, for your presentation. And now we shall take a short break for our sponsor video.
Asia Young Designer Awards by Nippon Paint is one of the longest running and largest student design awards in Asia. 14 years in the making, AYDA has worked closely with more than 1,200 educational institutions and have received more than 35,000 entries. AYDA has worked closely with professionals to help forge a closely knitted design community with the purpose of helping improve lives and communities. It is truly about cultivating the next generation of designers. If you're currently an architectural or interior design student, it's your time to shine. Help the world see designers who are able to envision the future of spatial design, which addresses the evolving needs of communities while factoring in critical environmental and significant cultural factors. Your design has to be emphatic and innovative while addressing problems faced by both mankind and our natural environment. It is your $1 million idea that will land you the title of the Asia Young Designer of the Year, which is worth up to $10,000 alongside a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to attend an all-expenses-paid 6-week design discovery program at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. On top of that, you will gain access to a network of AYDA alumni across Asia to help strengthen your perspectives and connections around the world. So, here's what we are looking for. Design concept. A design that fulfills an innate human need or helps solve a problem. Functionality, a versatile design that supports people, activities, and changes in life. Design innovation, a design which maximizes or leverages tech-enabled connectivity and/or intelligence. Sustainability and relevance, a design which comprises of sustainable and eco-friendly elements which help preserve the natural environment. Aesthetic and visual impact, a design which is aesthetically pleasing and effectively integrates social and cultural aspects for the users. Color usage, a design which showcases a brilliant display of balance between colors, materials, and design outputs. Delivery and presence. We look forward to having you at the national and international finals, where you will be delivering your ideas in front of a panel of professional judges. Will you be the next Asia Young Designer of the Year? Good luck and see you there! Join the Asia Young Designer Awards via www.asiayoungdesignerawards.com or follow us on LinkedIn. Or simply speak to your lecturers or faculty members who are involved. We hope to have you join the AYDA community. Good luck!